Welcome to a Stepping Stones to Awareness show. Today I've got Alex Thomson from Holland and he's from Eastern Approaches. Welcome, Alex. Have you had the bad weather that we've been suffering over here?
We certainly have, Caroline. In fact, the same weather tends to blow over a few hours after it comes to you. So what you had in Wiltshire this morning, we've got in Holland this afternoon, a whole gust and rainstorm.
Right. Well, Alex, for the people at home, for the benefits of the people who've never heard of you before, I know you're a regular contributor to UK Column and you're part of Eastern Approaches. You're based in Holland and you are a translator, are you? You can speak many languages.
That's one of my claims to fame, yes.
And you are a bit of a historian?
Yes, I did a history-related degree at Cambridge. It also had language content in it, and since then I've carried on my historical research.
So what I'd like to talk to you today about is the UN Migration Pact, because, you know, as I've said in many of my speeches now, we can forget about the Brexit side of things. We need to be looking at what's actually going on behind the curtain, if you like, and about corruption and what the government is really plotting behind closed doors. So this UN Migration Pact, from the media this week, it looks as if the UK is spearheading this pact. We're signing it, or have we signed it?
To my knowledge, we haven't signed it yet, Caroline, but there have been previous declarations along the way. Whenever the United Nations and the other international bodies do something, they test the water first and they try to establish a precedent. Look, you've already signed something like this, is the argument. So there has already been a Marrakesh declaration. In fact, going back to the very early 2000s, there have been declarations about the interconnectedness of the peoples of the various continents and all this kind of stuff. What's new now is this idea of a global compact. So all the nations supposedly are coming to come on board and say everyone has a right to live where they want, and we're just going to assist that process. If all of Africa wants to come to Europe, fine, so be it. Now, you just asked, is Britain in the lead? I think it's one of the lead powers in this. A lot of German reporting, most of which doesn't get translated, is now suggesting that Chancellor Angela Merkel was also one of the lead figures, and she may actually have submitted the draft of the Global Compact on Migration to the United Nations as well. Britain and or Germany seem to have done this as a stitch-up behind the scenes, yes.
So Germany will sign it.
At the moment, we're being told that Germany will sign it, but the other German-speaking nations may not. Austria certainly will not. So it's because of the agitation of an Austrian youth movement, basically the Austrian wing of the identitarian movement, and particularly their spearheading figure, Martin Sellner. That's what's made Austria decide it's going to look too bad now, because there's supposed to be a right-wing populist government or coalition in Austria. So originally, the UN permanent representatives of all the German-speaking countries were going to sign it behind the scenes. Then they all got their mugshots plastered over the German-speaking world and the internet and physical locations by Sellner's people. And so now the Austrians have said, "Nine, we're not going to sign it." But the Germans very much are.
So could the EU actually force all the countries to take in more people?
The EU wouldn't be able to, but the governments would behind the scenes, you know, because the EU is many things, isn't it? It's not a single forum. And what really matters is the national government delegations to the EU's various bodies, particularly the Council of the EU, where the strategic foreign policy and defence and security decisions are made, which really outranks the Commission and Parliament of the EU when it comes down to it. But it's a question of who's in the national apparatus, the civil service elite of each country. They could force things through, and that's exactly what the German-speaking permanent representatives to the UN wanted to happen.
So would the person in charge be Ollie Robbins over here?
At a political level, yes, because Ollie Robbins is the Prime Minister's éminence grise, really, his her right-hand man.
Oh, well, can I stop you there? Because can I introduce you to my Ollie Robbins?
Oh, you have an Ollie Robbins?
This is my Ollie Robbins. Yeah, I was speaking in Mansfield a couple of weeks ago, and I said, "Who is in charge of our government?" And people shouted out various people, and I said, "No, this is the guy, and this is Ollie Robbins." So if we can imagine, he is a fifth columnist, a total Europhile, and will he be? He alone will be able to say whether we can take in lots more people. Is that right? Do you reckon?
Well, people would quibble that at a formal level, Caroline, they might say Robbins is only an advisor, but it's not about advice in the end. It's about who actually holds the whip hand and who has the confidence to force things through, because prime ministers make decisions based on what the civil service is telling them, diplomats are telling them, and ultimately, when it comes to treaty signing, also they're given political advice, and they have to liaise with the Crown, in whose name they operate their powers. The Queen's not going to stop this, we suspect strongly. And so if the Prime Minister is minded to tell diplomats to sign, then it will be Ollie Robbins whispering in her ear that has the decisive decision, I think.
Oh dear. OK. So when we're saying about the Crown, doesn't Andrea Leadsom represent the Crown in Parliament?
Correct. Well, I was talking about this just on Wednesday in UK Column News. Her role is Leader of the House of Commons. It sounds like she is in the vanguard of MPs, doesn't it, saying what the people want through their elected representatives. But no, Leader of the House of Commons is a Crown appointment, a junior but important government appointment in Parliament. We get confused in the English-speaking world because in other countries it's clearer to see the ministers are not in Parliament. They're not even MPs in some cases, or even if they are, they sit outside Parliament to make their ministerial decisions. In the common law Anglo-Saxon countries, they're in Parliament. In most of the cases, that's the only way, apart from in the United States, that's the only way to be a minister is by being an MP. But the complication is Mrs. Leadsom and the others who are in the government are speaking on behalf of the Queen. That's the idea of the Crown in Parliament. So this is what Her Majesty's government wants to do to MPs, not on behalf of MPs. That's Andrea Leadsom's decisions.
Right. So does the Andrea Leadsom have like a regular phone calls then with the Queen?
No, that's all done through the Prime Minister. The only political interface in modern times between the actual Crown, the Crown personified as Her Majesty, and the government, so Her Majesty's government or the Crown in Parliament, is done by the Prime Minister on these Tuesday get-togethers. Of course, it may be that Andrea Leadsom knows very much what goes on there as Leader of the House of Commons, but that's all done through back channels.
Well, I guess we just sort of, the audience at home will probably be interested to know exactly who we're going to blame for this when we get signed up for it.
Oh, I'm sure they will. But ultimately, the buck stops politically with the Prime Minister. And ultimately, this is not a nice area to go into for many of us love our old Queen, but ultimately it's the Queen who signed her who swore her coronation oath and signed her coronation statement, who's undertaken to rule us according to our laws and customs. Those are the crucial words, and customs, which means that we cannot repudiate common law even if a coterie of advisors tell us to.
Right, so it's the Queen and Theresa May then?
Yes,
essentially.
Yes, these two ladies seem to have our fate in their hands.
Wow, OK. So that's on the 10th and the 11th of December. That follows on from the Marrakesh Declaration, doesn't it?
Yes, often these things are planned in to coincide quite nicely. And, Caroline, these things are not entirely unrelated at the strategic level. David Scott, our Scottish correspondent with Northern Exposure, who also works for the UK column under that brand, he has made the point the other day to us that actually the two wings of UK column reporting are coming together. One is European military unification, not EU army, but European military unification to form a tax base. And the other is the Russia and fake news and cyber agenda, which is about pinning the blame for everything on the Russians while we're doing it ourselves at an elite level. So these things come together because you want a casus belli, a cause for war, which allows, of course, the totalitarianism and clampdown at home, the martial law to be introduced, the tarnishing of dissidents as Russian stooges, and it provides also, with the other arm of it, EU military unification, it provides the excuse to beef up the armies and make them cross borders and make them indistinguishable from police and all the other stuff and the spying that goes on the population. Now, that's true also with the migration angle. The migration provides the latest threat. A previous one was the global warming stuff, which allows people to get themselves in a frenzy and to place their fate in the hands of a few of our wise overlords, another phrase that David Scott often uses. So the timing is not accidental. Well,
I mean, it's scary stuff, isn't it? People are talking about the final piece of the jigsaw with the military going to happen on the 14th of December. Do you believe that is the case?
I think fundamentally the PESCO agreements, well, there's so many other acronyms involved, but basically the audience should think of European military unification. That's the brand that covers it all. The ideas are already in place. The instrument that's going to be signed on the 14th is probably one of the last, if not the last, pieces of the jigsaw. And after that, it's all a question of whether the ideas and the strategy is up to speed to do what the documents have allowed them to do. The planning's already there on paper now.
Well, I know a couple of weeks ago I was outside Infel Barracks in York, and I was handing out leaflets produced by Veterans for Britain, warning about military union. None of the soldiers admitted or even acknowledged that this was happening. How has this happened?
It's a process of subterfuge, Caroline. If people look at ukcolumn.org, and particularly if they go to the defence part, which they can do by finding it from the menu or going to ukcolumn.org/defence, or by going to ukcolumn.org and then going to the EU military unification panel halfway down the page on the right, they will see a chronology. And if they watch the videos that of the talks that David Ellis and I have made, they will see that this goes back many decades. And so really it's happened because a bunch of banking-minded elitists decided really between the wars, and certainly during the Second World War, that they were going to unify Europe as a political blob under Anglo-American banking control. And that is how it slipped through, because they foresaw that the first thing to do would be to merge heavy industries. That was done openly in the 50s. Then the EEC was based on that idea. Then they were going to have to go slice by slice until they could merge the currencies, and the other wing of this middle stage, together with the currencies, was the militaries. But of course, you spend your money, you see it, either as physical currency, or you see what symbol is used if you're doing digital transactions, a pound sign, a euro sign, a dollar sign. So the currency bit was in the open. People don't see their armies training, and even if they do, they don't really understand who's commanding those officers, so that behind the scenes at the civilian planning level. So that can be done more secretly, and that's what's happened. And so our soldiers, seamen and airmen have been diddled as to the loyalties of many of their senior officers, the think tanks who are steering the training and equipping of those officers and ships, regiments and airframes. That's all been done behind the scenes at a central European level, but it's not a continental plan ultimately, it's a City of London and Manhattan plan.
So if all these plans are being arranged by the City of London actually isn't part of the UK, is it?
No, of course, people will pick holes in that argument, but you can actually see, if you look at Magna Carta 1215, that even by that stage, the City of London and the Church of England had already got an existence separate from the Crown and from the people. And this was before we had Parliament. So they were entrenched privileges which the bishops of the Church of England held to be able to try their own clergy separately from the Lords and Commons. And there were privileges which the geographical unit of the City of London had, mirroring those of the Vatican in Rome and those later of Washington, D.C. within the United States. I know that this sometimes descends into kind of cliched arguments, and people will say, no, that the extreme forms of these arguments don't stack up because the City of London is geographically in Britain. Fair enough, but look at how the Corporation of London runs the city. Look at how they have their own police force. They organise their own decisions. They won't let the Queen in except with their own sniggering escorts. There's many ways in which de facto the City of London acts as a law unto itself. They have their own man in Parliament, the Remembrancer, not an MP, but one who sits there making notes of who's favourable to the bankers and who isn't.
And how does, what position does the Speaker, Bercow, what is his real role in all of this?
It's very hard to pick apart, Caroline, what the Speaker's real role is, because the Speaker embodies the idea which the House of Commons more widely has of itself, which is we're sovereign and untouchable and we're a law unto ourselves, which is a misreading of the British Constitution, but it's one that many MPs have. And the Speaker is the personification of that. Of the 650 MPs, he's the one who says, I insist on our privileges. He gives the order to shut the doors when the Queen approaches, or Black Rod, her officer, when the Parliament is ceremonially opened each year. So we really do not know what Mr. Bercow thinks his own role is. And he's got this Remembrancer sitting at his feet. And it may well be that the Remembrancer whispers in his ear from time to time.
Well, he seems to have a lot of power because he's been able to resurrect some rule from hundreds of years ago to ensure that one of the MPs from Leicester has all his charges, allegations against him, and his investigation totally dropped. Do you remember that
Yes,
case?
well, it is the case because in a civil law jurisdiction like a continental country, this would be obvious because the constitution would have it in a single document. Members of parliament enjoy qualified immunity. You can't prosecute them while in office, and if you want to try them, you would have to strip them of their immunity, and a judicial process would be ongoing with fellow parliamentarians of the accused being involved. In a common law jurisdiction, these things are done on precedent and concept rather than on the letter of a single piece of paper in many cases. So there is a guide to Parliament called Erskine May, and it goes through many editions, which goes through all the protocols. But if you look at that or any constitutional law textbook focused on England and Wales or any other common law jurisdiction, it will hedge about the ideas with adverbs like generally, customarily, by precedent, historically, because ultimately, unless we assert our sovereignty over our own members of parliament, they're just going to run away with it and say, we have your sovereignty vested in us. We are untouchable beings. It takes us to assert that that's not the case.
Well, there's an e-petition out, and we know how useful e-petitions are not. But there's one on the UN Migration Pact. I haven't checked the latest numbers on there. Perhaps somebody in the chat room can let us know how many signatures are currently on there. But is it likely to be, are we likely to not sign up next week if the number of signatures amasses to over 100,000? I mean, how can they have a debate after they've signed up to the pact?
Well, Caroline, my faith is very low in us being able to dissuade the British representation at the UN from signing next week. For one thing, this has got off the ground pretty late in the day. I don't think that's the fault of the activists, because it's precisely been behind a smokescreen of silence for so long so that we couldn't get a campaign off the ground earlier. And for another thing, this is quite new. It's unusual for a coordinated petition across different jurisdictions in Europe and further afield to got off the ground. And what makes this one pretty unique to my mind is it's asking the Crown not to sign a treaty. Well, that's what this is. It's a treaty obligation. So it's sovereigns, governments dealing with each other rather than sovereigns dealing with us through the national government apparatus. So it's quite unprecedented in that the Crown and Parliament are not going to enjoy this, the government particularly, because we're actually saying something that we haven't really said before, which is you are not going to make agreements behind our back binding future parliaments, which of course parliamentarians claim they can't be bound by statute. Future parliament always has the prerogative of changing its mind, supposedly. They don't. So
sorry, Alex, I'm just going to interrupt you there. So are you saying that the people really are not consulted at all, are they?
In making treaties, the people are never consulted historically, Caroline, and this is a problem. Many countries that have their constitutions in a single document make it clear that Parliament must be consulted, or even Parliament must ratify a treaty. That's not the case in the British system. We are told that the balance to protect that is that when judges have an argument put before them, look, we've signed a treaty, so we have to follow through on this globalist measure. We're told the balance is that English judges and indeed Scots judges in their different legal system will say, hang on, we are dualistic in this country. So we don't just accept that a treaty is law. It has to be replicated in statute first. So that's the supposed check and balance, but it's custom. It's up to a judge and what he thinks on the day. And whether a jury is involved is also open to question. And it's a judicial remedy, not one based in the constitution or in politics. So actually, there is nothing to stop a government signing something in our name with another government. That's what the EEC accession was all about.
But yet, the Houses of Parliament, especially the House of Commons, is supposed to be a grand jury, isn't it?
Yes, but this is one of the roles that the parliamentarians are now rejecting. They are supposed to be, because they are the lower house, and so likewise with the US Congress, the lower house of their system, House of Representatives in Congress, they are supposed to be the High Court of the nation and the grand jury of public opinion, saying this will fly and that's a no-goer. That's one of their inherent roles. But of course, they are rejecting that now because they are lobbied by so many special interests in which they may have pecuniary or other obligations, and that they are claiming that they have only their sublime supreme conscience to guide them, and even that their constituents cannot tell them how to vote, which is a complete repudiation of the historical British Constitution. But that's the state that MPs have got themselves into now.
Well, Alex, we're just going to wrap this show up now because this was part one and we're doing part two. very shortly. So what we're going to do is we're going to look through all the comments, and then we'll launch a part 2 in a minute. So thank you, Alex, and we'll be back shortly. And to everybody at home, thank you so much for watching Stepping Stones to Awareness. I'm Caroline Stevens, and I've had on Alex Thomson from Holland on today, and we'll be back to you again shortly. Thank you for listening. Bye.